Good morning, everyone. Today is Wednesday, May 27th, and on today's screencast, I will go over pages 10 to 11 in our Unit 7 packet on the printing press, arguably, in my humble opinion, the most epic invention in all of history. And this is a perfect topic today to transition ourselves from the idea of the Renaissance, this rebirth of Greco-Roman culture, and how artists and scientists and philosophers of the Renaissance period are using that to kind of change the culture of the times. And we will see how this printing press helps spread a lot of those ideas and that rediscovered knowledge of the classical civilizations, but also helps change the way the church is run. And we'll see that in our topic tomorrow, the Protestant Reformation. And on Friday, we will look at some causes of the Reformation and our key spotlight historical figure of this unit, Martin Luther, who will use the printing press to spread his ideas about how he wants the church to be changed. All right, so let's go over to our packet. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what is on these two pages and what we want to accomplish today. So we're going to do a little bit of reading on the first page. This is actually going to have us look backwards into the history of papermaking, all the way back to central China in the 100s before Common Era. So we'll take a little bit of time to recall what we remember about how paper and writing and printing has come along. And on page 11, we'll take a little bit of a closer look at the innovation, this new addition of a printing press that Johannes Gutenberg, a German engraver, makes in, what's the date up here? The date is 1454. We have a few questions here to answer, and some of these actually go along with our video clip. And if you're reading the announcement bullets on the Classroom Stream page, I did change the time that I want you to watch this video clip. Originally, it was only a couple of minutes, and then I looked over that link again, and I think either the link had become dead or changed. So it's not the original one that matches up to these questions anymore. But if we watch the whole 10 minutes and 25 seconds of this video clip, it will give us the information we need for our questions below. All right, so that is our pieces of our task for the pages 10 and 11 today. So our question, remember, is the invention of the printing press. Is it the most epic invention in history? I think so, but today's information will help you make that determination on your own. So here we want to read a little text, analyze a few images, and answer a couple of questions. So just as an introduction, take a look at these two pictures I put here. The one on the left just gives you a little sneak peek into how large, almost newspaper-like pages that we're used to seeing today are being developed for the first time by Johannes Gutenberg. And it's using this device called a printing press. So you can kind of see, like a screw or a corkscrew, that this device would be cranked and actually presses the ink onto paper using this new innovation called movable type. So go over to the little cartoon here to get an idea of what movable type might be like. So as you guys watch, as you kind of look at this little scene here, let's read the caption together. These two folks are saying, "I can't help thinking there's more you could do with this movable type idea of yours, Mr. Gutenberg." And it's showing, like, maybe Gutenberg's son, there's a little baby on the floor playing with alphabet blocks. Something we've probably seen before, or maybe had as kids, where you take letters, you stack them up, you play with them, and kids get a little bit of an idea of how letters come together to make words. That's basically the idea of this innovation of movable type. So keep that picture in your head, and we'll see how movable type actually works on our next page. But for this page, we want to go a little bit back and revisit some knowledge of paper making that we learned about earlier this year. So these two questions we'll answer together in a few minutes on the slides, but let's read through together and I'll help you comprehend some of the concepts in this reading. So by 1300, papermaking and printing technology reached Europe from China and the Middle East. Papermaking had contributed to golden ages in China and the Middle East and contributed to the preservation of Greek and Roman learning that had been lost in Europe, but preserved by scholars in the Ottoman Empire. So our question is, how might papermaking and printing have contributed to golden ages? I'm going to have you guys answer this on your own in just a second, but I want to help you analyze this document over here first. So this image is called the paper trail. When we learn of something, some new device, new invention, when we wonder where it came from, the phrase that people will use is that there's always a paper trail. Even investigators and detectives trying to find out what happened in a mystery case always say that there's got to be a paper trail. There's got to be documentation somewhere that can be dug up in an archive that will give us proof of something that happened, some clues. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. This question of how might papermaking and printing have contributed to golden ages, think of a paper trail. If we are living over here in Europe in the Middle Ages or even afterwards, and we want to know where gunpowder, silk, the compass, anything that we're using here, where it originally came from, we need to follow the paper trail. And because paper was originally made in Han China in the hundreds BC, or before Common Era, and eventually makes its way all the way to Europe over the next several hundred years, there's innovations that can happen because of this. So think about paper is something that you write things down on. And as you're writing things down, you are preserving that knowledge on a tangible item. You're not just keeping it in your mind or telling someone a story so that they can hopefully remember it and tell someone else later on. You're creating a piece of hard evidence that people can read later on. So as golden ages are being experienced in China, India, the Middle East, like there's Baghdad, this House of Wisdom, capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, where the Islamic civilization had their golden age. All these inventions and achievements of golden ages can be recorded and learned about over the years as information and knowledge makes their way to the West. So take a second here, pause, and answer this question on your own. We will go to the slides in just a moment to answer it together, though. All right, so let's keep going on our reading for this page. It introduces our next question. So follow with me right here. The earliest books were written on scrolls from the 2nd century AD, or Common Era, to the present time. However, most books have been produced bound at one edge. During the Middle Ages, manuscript books, which is basically manual writing, manuscript books, were produced by monks who worked with pen and ink in a copying room known as a scriptorium. Even a small book could take months to complete, and a book the size of the Bible could take several years. So they're talking about kind of the evolution of how paper is put into what we now know as books. So way back in Greek and Roman times, you probably have seen scrolls, kind of these round tubes of paper that you would have to roll out and hold at two ends and try to read the pages that way. And eventually, in the Middle Ages, we start to see, actually dating back to about Roman times, they start to put pages together in bound books as well, called a codex. But we start to see books being produced with a spine, bound at one side of the pages. And these style books in the medieval times, the Middle Ages, are being copied by hand. It takes a long, long time to produce one book when you're going letter by letter, line by line, especially in kind of fancy old calligraphy style writing. So this question here, we can answer from what we've read, but also a little bit of our intuitive knowledge. So let's answer these two together over on our slides. All right, our first question, how might papermaking and printing have contributed to golden ages? So remember what we were talking about with our paper trail map here, as ideas go from the golden age of central China, in Han Dynasty China, all the way to Europe over the centuries. Printing on paper could have been used to record the golden age achievements of these civilizations, and then those achievements can be passed on to the next civilization on that hard evidence piece of paper. And the next generations and next civilizations can learn from them and innovate their own additions to that invention or their own ideas to that process that they're learning about. Our second question is, what effects might the way books being produced in the Middle Ages by manual copying, what kind of effect might that have had on Europeans and Europe? So think about the number of books that would be available doing it that way, the cost of those books, and the number of people who could read them. Well, if we're copying books by hand in a scriptorium, this would limit the number of books that were made. If it takes several years to copy an entire Bible, or months or a few years to copy one smaller book, there's not going to be very many books available. So if very few books were produced, the price of those books would be really high. Think of supply and demand. If there's like a limited edition of something that comes out that you want, it's probably really expensive because there's only a handful out there, and they know that the special status and allure of that item is going to fetch a really high price. So this is going to cause that the fact that only the rich, only the upper class nobility and the clergy of the Middle Ages hierarchy system, the feudal system, only those high class, wealthy people would be able to buy books. In fact, they were the only ones that were educated and could be able to read them anyways. All right, so we have 3 questions to look at on page 11. So page 10 gives us a little look back into the fact of how people in the Middle Ages can't really read all that much anyways, but as paper making and writing makes their way over to Europe, we're going to see how Johannes Gutenberg will step in and create a innovation of movable type that will really change the game and put books into more people's hands so that they can learn how to read them. So this timeline is just a different visual than what we saw in our paper trail image. So just to kind of refresh our memory once again, going back to BCE, 100, 200 BCE, in Han China, they're learning to make durable pulp paper. And then in the 600s, Japan gets this technology. 100 years later, the Arab world, the Middle Eastern Islamic civilizations, learn about that same technology. In the 1300s, beginning of the Middle Ages, or not beginning, but kind of the heart of the Middle Ages, the methods of paper making had reached Europe. And it's in the 1400s where German engravers like Johannes Gutenberg start to innovate and make their own device called movable type. And the famous kind of trivia of this topic is that the first printed book that was made with Gutenberg's printing press was the Bible. We'll see a little bit more in our next topic about how the information of the Bible and the church itself is changed by the effect of this printing press. All right, so read this little introduction with me, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about the video clip. The rapid growth of learning that occurred during the Renaissance was made possible by the availability of large numbers of inexpensive books. In medieval times, books like the one seen here were painstakingly copied by hand, a page at a time, usually by Catholic monks called scribes living in monasteries. So we just saw a picture, an image of that. We know the effect of having only a couple books made every couple of years is going to make them very expensive. Not a lot of people can get those books in their hands, so there's not a lot of information that's being spread around. But as we start to see movable type added to this printing press invention, this will put books into more people's hands. So let's introduce our 3 questions. I'll do that over on our slides here. So the first question here I want to do with you, and then the second 2 questions, questions 4 and 5, this goes along with the video clip, and I'll tell you how I want you to answer those. But question 3 says, what was the effect of producing books only in Latin during the Middle Ages? So remember that during the Middle Ages, most people could not read at all, let alone understand Latin. Latin was that language of the old Roman Empire, and it was also the language that the church used to record their documents, to copy down the Bible in, and they even said masses in Latin as well. So most people attending a mass of the church, a service in the Middle Ages, generally couldn't understand everything that was going on. So they relied on the church to interpret those scriptures in the Bible. And actually, it wasn't until the 1970s where the Catholic Church changed saying the Mass from Latin into English or Spanish or wherever you are in the world listening to that Mass. So it took a really long time for the church to kind of modernize itself. If you have parents or grandparents that were alive before the 1970s, and if they were Catholic or Christian and went to church, they probably remember listening to certain Latin phrases. They can maybe still recite some of those phrases, but they might not really know exactly what they mean. So it's Johannes Gutenberg that invents this new piece to the printing process called movable type. So our questions 4 and 5 kind of ask us what the impact of that innovation is going to be. So number 4 says, what innovations did Johannes Gutenberg add to the process of making books? One of them is movable type, but I want you guys to watch this clip. It's a little bit too long for us to watch on the screencast here together. And I want you to answer this question with a little more elaboration of what movable type is and some of the other processes that he uses to make books faster, cheaper, easier. And question 5 says, what impact did the printing press have on the production and circulation of books in Europe? I'll give you a little hint. This is going to be kind of the opposite of the effect that copying books in the Middle Ages by hand had. So if copying books by hand makes very few books available and makes them very expensive, think about what the impact might have been once books are produced quicker and can be circulated into more people's hands. So that gives you a little bit of guidelines as to how I want you to answer these 2 questions. But also, please watch this video clip and that information will help you add to a more thorough answer for numbers 4 and 5. All right, guys, so that does it for today. Remember that this printing press invention is going to be kind of the transition, the bridge from the overall idea of the Renaissance to how the new ideas of the Renaissance are now making their way into the church. And we'll see how that impacts the Protestant Reformation and how Martin Luther uses the printing press to further those ideas and to start this reforming, this change in the church. All right, guys, have a great day. If you have any questions at all, give me an email and I will help you out. Stay happy, stay healthy, and I will see you tomorrow.